the purpose of this panel is we would like to put 20 women together at the end of, so we really try to recruit people. So 20 women from 20 years old upward to see how we can help them by 2020, 25, and to kind of like see how we're building up these women across Africa. So that's why we put this panel together. And each of them will tell us what they think about. They're amazing, but they've been built. I mean, Ola is one of my favorite person in Africa. She's so amazing. I want to find out how was she built? Who built her? Did she build herself? Who is she? Why she's here? What did she do? Why is she doing all the stuff she's doing? And Nimco is doing amazing work around FGM in Africa. Why is she doing what she's doing? Who's building her to be this strong woman, independent, activist, vocal? And I've got Natalia. She's talking to policymakers every day. Why is she doing what she does? Why is she waking up every single morning trying to do something for Africa? And you'll have our mama there. You can argue that she was built, or she built herself. You can argue that today, we look up to her. You can say she's been building herself, building other women, making a difference in Africa. Who knows? So we're going to debate this. That's why we have this panel. So I want all our intelligent mind to think, to debate. Feel free to interrupt. But the goal is, how do you build an African woman? An African woman is seen in the West as an object of development. An African woman is not seen as a CEO, as a doctor, as an activist, as a minister. We don't see this often. We don't see these narratives. We don't see this in the West. But what affects an African woman affects a non-African woman. I think all of us, like I said yesterday in one of the panels, if you are being dumped by a guy, you cry at the same time. There's no white, there's no black. Your heart hurts. It hurts a lot. You cry the same amount of crying. You call your same amount of friends. You guys know that. I was not downplaying, but I'm just telling you. So you know what I'm saying. So it's the same. We're all the same. There's no white or black woman. So I want to make sure that you guys here and the non-Africans also take something out of this and go home and think about, how did I build myself? Think about it on the train. How did I build myself? Who built me? So I'm going to just like Dr. Ola, she's from Nigeria, she's amazing. So I'm going to let her tell us 5 minutes about herself. So I'm going to give 5 minutes to each of the ladies to tell us who they are, what they do, and what they think about this panel. Ola, I'm so grateful you are here.
Thank you. Lovely to see you again as well. How to build an African woman. Such an interesting topic, and I'm really glad that you put this panel together. My name's Ola. I'm a doctor. I'm a trainee helicopter pilot, and I'm an entrepreneur. And I started the first indigenous air ambulance service in West Africa, which transports hundreds of patients every year from areas where they've overwhelmed level of care to a more suitable level of care for them. And I live in Nigeria, and I'm surrounded by African women every day. And I think that I'll use the rest of my 5 minutes to talk about what I feel, the factors that I feel affect women in Africa. And I think there's probably 3 main, in my mind, groups of factors that affect how we as African women feel about ourselves. The first one is sort of our relationship with ourselves and our own bodies. I think the second one is our relationship with our peers. And the third is probably our relationship with the world. So I'll probably talk about, I can't talk about everything in 5 minutes, so I'll probably talk about the first. In Nigeria, last week I went to a wedding, and I realized that I'm probably the only one in Lagos right now that is not bleaching. And you know, one of those things, you're like, should I start now? Have I missed the boat? Is it too late? And, you know, the bleaching comes in soap, it comes in cream, and it goes up. I mean, the very, very serious ones, I want to be white in the shortest amount of time. They've now turned to IV drugs. So they go to the hairdresser and they have like IV, glutathione in the hairdressers, given to them intravenously, all in the quest to be yellow. So I'm sure, that it all starts. I think the how to build an African woman and how African women feel about themselves all starts from how our relationships with our own bodies and our definition of what is beautiful and what is attractive and what makes us confident. And Nigeria is the sort of highest consumer of bleaching products in the world. We want to be white by force, to the extent that you look around the average wedding in Lagos and everybody has that, that strange yellow that is caused by bleach. We laugh, but I think that this is where it all starts from. We need to be more confident in ourselves and our bodies.
Thank you so much. Nimko, you've been doing so many work around FGM. Just tell us a little bit about you and what do you think about this panel?
Hi, I'm Nimko Ali, and I'm an anti-FGM activist. I always say FGM activist. I'm like, no, I'm against it. I'm an anti-FGM activist, and I'm also in the civil service. And the title of this panel, because I always say, don't speak for other women, allow them to speak for themselves. And I thought, how do you build an African woman? I'm thinking, I can't really speak for that. So then I thought, let me bring it back to where my heritage is from. How do you build an East African woman? And that's actually, let me narrow that down back to how do you build a Somali woman, and then bring it back to my family. Because for me, living in the fourth wave of feminism, there's 4 generations of my family that's alive, and it's only the 4th one that hasn't been cut, that hasn't been through FGM. And for me, I realized that every single one of us was built because of the fact that what happens is what FGM essentially does is it breaks you as a woman, and then you're created through the patriarchal society within those male-controlled families are. So my grandmother was built to be an obedient, illiterate wife and mother and so on. And then my mother was built to be an obedient wife and mother. And then I was built to just be cut but nothing else. So I came out screaming, I think, out of the womb. And then there's my niece, which is quite interesting because I was talking about other things that kind of we're socially constructed to do, about the concept of what it is to be African, what it is to be black. And this whole concept about skin tones. And that was something that I've always grown up with. And I actually asked my niece, who's 3 years old yesterday, I said, Sophia, what color are you? And she looked at herself and she said, vanilla yellow. Which means to me is everybody's telling her she's black, everybody's telling her she's this, she's that. For her, it's like race has no meaning, nor does sexuality, nor does what it is to be a woman. So it's about this thing that I'm living, and I'm seeing the first generation within my family that has the ability to construct herself. And I'm there to enable her to be whoever and wherever she wants to be. And the concept of me, why I really understood that what FGM was, it was very much, it was... What happens about Africa is the fact that I was spoken about and I was spoken to, but never engaged with. And this is what happens around the issue of FGM. The issue of FGM has no place in a continent, it has no place in a religion, it has a place in the oppression of women. And for me, it was that. It wasn't because I was black, it wasn't because I was Somali, it wasn't because I was Muslim, it wasn't because of any of these things. It's because I was a girl. And to be free and fearless meant that I would challenge the society that I was living in. Therefore, I had to be broken down. And FGM was the tool in order to knock me down, and then I had to be rebuilt. So for me, building an African woman means actually enabling her and empowering her, and hopefully that's what I want to kind of discuss. And I'd like to say, like, I didn't go to Africa. I was born in Africa, but grew up here since I was 4 months old. And then I went back when I had FGM as a 7-year-old, so I had like a really negative view of Africa. But then I went back in April this year after 26 years, and it was really interesting meeting Edna in West Africa and seeing all these amazing, powerful African women. And there's this concept that we have here in the UK where you talk about survivors of sexual violence and rape or FGM. And I said in that kind of naive kind of context of language to a woman in Burkina Faso, I said, are there any survivors? And she looked at me, she said, what do you mean? So where FGM is 98%, every single woman has had FGM. And she said, you're either a survivor or you're dead. And that's what African women are. They're the ones that are surviving and keeping the continent alive, and they're the ones that actually are building the continent. So that's why, for me, that's what I see what an African woman is.
Very powerful. So I'm glad this was put up together. You see what I was telling you? This way. Naturally, tell us about all the work you're doing in South Africa. Like we were discussing earlier, how do you build an African woman? How did you build yourself to be here today?
Well, that's a very, very interesting subject. I trained as an economist, but I've been working over the last 12, 13 years as an activist, really advocating for issues that are most important in Africa in terms of how Africa can economically empower itself, and also how we can socially empower ourselves as a continent. And the condition and status of African women has been an issue that's been central to the work that I have been doing. And I've been privileged to meet a lot of amazing African women that have overcome a number of barriers and hurdles and have been an inspiration to my life. And then talking about the subject of really how to build an African woman, I think for me what I've learned over the years, and maybe having had the privilege not only of living and working in Africa, but also living and working in Europe and the United States, is that the woman's struggle is universal, right? So there's something that is to be learned about how society works and how society overall hinders the fulfillment of a woman's full human experience. And when it comes to the African woman, I think, and maybe any woman in general, you become a product of your environment. If we take a fetus, for example, the result of it being born into a healthy baby is dependent on its environment. It's dependent on the nutrition that is coming into the mother. And so when we look at ourselves as African women and what we've become, we're really a product of our environment. Our environment beginning from our families, the things that our families tell us, the things that our families do for us. It comes from our environment as in our community, the opportunities and the barriers that are put within around us in our community, but then also extending to government, and also the vision that the government has in terms of how communities should move forward and how women should not be left behind in that level of progress. And I think that for me, what has really been significant looking at the life of an African woman is that the social, cultural, and religious barriers, and even economic barriers, when it also comes to poverty, have really been significant determinants in terms of what sort of a woman that one actually becomes. I think for me, apart from the image that's out there that an African woman is a victim, I think there has been, maybe as a consequence of the media, a lack of a recognition that actually African women are very ambitious, African women are very resilient, and even when we look at our families, when I look at my mother, right, my mother has been the bigger driving force, despite all the constraints that she's faced socially, economically, and so on within the community in terms of getting her children and her family where she'd like to be. When I look at my older sisters, for example, they've really been driving forces within their lives and within their families, and sometimes as you take this journey, there are barriers that you face. And I mean, coming back to my mom, it's because when raising us, she made it very clear to the boys and the girls that you're all equal. So everyone gets to do the housework, right? And everyone gets to get the same opportunities, whether it's the school that one goes to, whether it's the clothes that one does get. And so you find that as we're navigating through life into adult life, my brother can be my supporter, my sponsor when I'm getting challenged with sort of negative views about what a woman should be allowed to do or should be allowed to say within society. So just bringing back my argument to say that we become a product of our environment, and our environment needs to be looked at closely, or probably needs to be changed for us to build a stronger and more assertive African women.
Excellent. Thank you so much, National, for the very strong view. Now we heard from the doctor, was changing her country, doing amazing work. She built herself to be where she is today. We heard from the activist who's challenging and kicking ass, basically. And now we can hear from the former minister of Somaliland, a powerful woman, an amazing woman. I've been learning from her for the last 3 days. Amazing to just share this panel. We're just so honored. So I'm going to ask, Mama, what do you think has helped you build yourself today and paying it forward to all the women you are looking after in Somaliland?
Thank you, Miriam. I think, as my the previous speaker said, Africa has very resilient women. And I think it's the environment that shapes us. Some of us flow with the tide and say, this is who we are, this is what we should be, invisible, don't argue, just do as you're told. And then there are a few of us who say, well, wait a minute, maybe I should not be flowing with the tide. Maybe there are different ways of doing things. To give you a little background of where I come from, I was privileged to have been born into a family where my father was the first and the most senior Somali health professional. My grandfather was the Postmaster General of Somaliland when Somaliland was former British Somaliland Protectorate. I had access to education. I had privileges that very few others had. I won a scholarship, came to England, studied as a nurse. I'm a midwife, and went home in 1961. And that's when my eyes were opened to the needs of my people. Where I had been trained in England in facilities that had every equipment that they needed, specialists. There was a hierarchy. If a patient had a problem, it could be referred to a different level of a health professional. And then suddenly I went home in 1961, and I worked in a hospital, headed the hospital, where we had one doctor for 400 patients. Now that one doctor, Dr. Ali, who is the first Somali doctor we had in Somaliland, had been a student here when I too was a student here, was dealing with surgery, outpatients, intensive care. I was calling him for obstetric emergencies, and he would say, Edna, I only have a pair of hands. You deal with it. And that taught me to deal with as much and as many of the problems as I could with what we had. And that's when I started to train other midwives, other nurses, so that I would have fewer complications to deal with. That's when we started the first prenatal clinic. That's when we started the first giving vaccinations to the newborn. And that gives you a platform from where you can teach, advise, become a role model. And then I married the man who had been the first president of an independent Somali nation, the president of Somaliland, after it became independent from Great Britain. Later, he was the prime minister, and I was the first lady who had so many social obligations. Following that, I joined the United Nations and became the very first Somali male or female civil servant to be appointed to the United Nations. So these responsibilities and these positions mold you, shape you, make you realize your responsibilities. And when, after a long career with the United Nations, I retired 17 years ago, and they forgot to tell me that I'm retired, I went home to a country that had been totally devastated by war. My plans of retirement, my plans of chasing beautiful butterflies in the Amazon rainforest, my plans of having enough time to attend all the fashion shows and go to all the boutiques and all the things that had been my life in my previous reincarnation were suddenly wiped off. My country was destroyed. 95% of our people had been killed in the war. Whatever facilities and health and education we had been destroyed. Mass graves were being identified by the United Nations, and I think 26 mass graves have been catalogued and identified by the United Nations. That was my country. there was no place for boutiques. There was no place for bridge. There was no place for golf. There was no place for all the things that I, in my previous incarnation, had thought important. So what I did is I just recycled my whole life, just turned everything I had into cold cash. I loved my beautiful Mercedes, yes, but you can buy many bedpans with a Mercedes, believe me. So I just went home, got a land that was no longer loved or respected by the people, because it had been a killing ground before, it had been a garbage dump. It was a place that was so cursed and hated that nobody gave me any competition to own it. So that's where I started to build my hospital. And believe me, that's where I began to live. That is where I am today. That's where I flew from 3 or 4 days ago. And that's where I hope to serve whatever time God requires me to serve on this planet. But I also wish to be that example, that small fish that will attract bigger fish back home, the Nimcos of this world, to carry forward the campaign that I started 40 years ago, when everybody thought that I should not be speaking about such a taboo subject, to see that there is a future generation, that it can be challenged, has made my life worth living. Thank you.
Thank you, Mama. Thank you so much. Thank you. You see my Erica moments, right? Do you see where we're going now? Do you see where we're going? Wait until you guys start asking questions. Then we will see where we're going. It makes sense to me. It makes sense to me to understand how to build an African woman. We can replace the template, how to build a British woman, how to build any sort of woman. It makes sense to me. It makes sense to me for us to start talking about things properly around women. I mean, really properly. See an African woman in Kinshasa today. She has no future. The system she is in is dead. Just think about that for a moment. Think about the opportunities young girls have in this country. But they're not building themselves. Nobody's helping them build themselves to be strong women tomorrow. Ola, when you sit down and really reflecting into where you started until now, where did you get the strength to really start? I'm going to build myself. I'm going to do something for my country. Where do you get that from?
To be honest, I cheated. Because I grew up in England, and I grew up, my foster parents were white, so they actually believed that and taught me that I could do anything, that I was equal to a man. They never taught me that I was inferior. However, women that grow up in Nigeria are taught that they are inferior, and in Nigeria, calling yourself a feminist is like calling yourself a robber. It's something that people actually classify as a dirty word. Anybody that believes that women are equal to men are seen as radical, are seen as a borderline criminal. Nobody wants to hear that word. It is a dirty word. A typical Nigerian household will have let's say a 7-year-old boy and a 9-year-old girl. And the 9-year-old girl, when the boy and the girl come back from school, the 9-year-old girl will go to the kitchen and the 7-year-old boy will go upstairs to do his homework. And the 9-year-old girl will be told to go and serve her younger brother food when it's time to eat food, and she has to arrange it for him, and she has to get water to wash his hands because the boy is too big to go down and wash his hands with the tap. So with that kind of training, with that kind of psychology being implanted as just young children, the woman is trained to see herself as inferior, and the guy is trained to see himself as a boss. So when they get into school, the girl is less likely to put up her hand to answer a question. When she goes into the workplace, she's less likely to put forth her ideas. So how do we tell a young girl who has been trained since she was as young as she can remember, not to state her opinions, to be subservient, and to aspire to cooking jollof rice, to run a multinational corporation. Women who have been trained like that find it very, very difficult to break out of the mold. So that is not how to build an African woman.
No, that's a very good point. Mama, go ahead.
That was really my
good.
point.
That's fine. Mama Edmund, I was just going to ask you, the other point you really wanted to talk about is that you've been into this, you've been around presidents, you've been around presidents in Africa, you've been everywhere basically. So when you see today a young African woman who's trying to build herself with the system we have in Africa, very, very poor policies and legal systems we have in the continent, across the continent, you're sitting next to a national right now. What do you think we need to do right now to help those young girls? When I see, for example, advertisements saying we need to educate girls, I think that's, again, we're robbing the girls' life, because sometimes education for girls, when you hear the defeat people telling you education for girls, actually it's not education for girls. They go to Africa and they do something very, very minimal and come back to the UK, have beautiful website with a young girl sitting down, holding a pen, and then for them, it's all sorted. Now, what do you think we need to really tackle, Mama, to start really changing mindsets maybe from these NGOs who are trying to maybe build or help those young girls to get confidence?
Well, I think we should learn to rely on ourselves and on our resources. NGOs are there for their own survival. They usually come with no resources, and they identify a need, and they write a beautiful project proposal, and they get funding for it. What young Africans should do is, first of all, be proud of who you are. You are who you are. This is your continent. You belong. You were born into the richest continent in the world. There are more natural resources in Africa than all the other continents put together. So be proud of who you are, and also be proud of yourself. And don't think of yourself as being worth less than anybody else. My late father used to say, first learn to do things with your heart, and then your hands will learn to do it. Education, to me, means skills development. Learning to read and write, yes, is the tool that will enable you to reach that profession, or learn those skills. But it's not everybody who's had an education who then goes on to learning a skill. They think that the simple fact that they can read and write is enough. Maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, when there were few of us educated people, those who could read and write were valuable. Those who could become interpreters, those who could become translators. That was all the education you needed to know, being able to translate or interpret. But today the competition is so great that you need to supplement those reading and writing skills and spoken languages that you have been taught.
Do you think, sorry, Mama, to interrupt. Do you think we need to believe more in women? Do you think we need to believe more on them?
I think, of course, there's, the women are the mothers of the nation. You take away a mother, you have destroyed an entire family, you've destroyed an entire community. And that's why I concentrate on training midwives. Not because I'm a midwife, but because the nation needs midwives. It is midwives who help the community, not only during childbirth, but in how to bring up the children, and how to look after the environment, and how to look after their nutrition, and how to look after the community needs. Women are an essential member of the community that they live in. And instead of being considered as worth half of a man, I think women are worth 10 times as much as a man. But women must learn to believe that. And you must learn to believe that you are also holding many and much of the responsibility of your community. And if you see something that you can fix, that you can correct, that you can improve on, don't wait for somebody's permission to make you do it. Do it the best way you can do it, or speak about it, or mention it, and find like-minded members of your community to go and do something about whatever it is you think needs fixing. You can do it. If a retired old woman like me can go back to Africa, can go to East Africa, a country with the highest maternal mortality rate in the world, build a hospital, train midwives, and reduce maternal mortality to a quarter of the national average, you can do 10 times better than that. Today, that little hospital, built on a garbage dump, built on a site that was hated by everybody, we've delivered over 16,000 babies. We've performed 5,000 or 6,000 operations, not only obstetrical, but we in the Horn of Africa, we're the only place where a child who's born with hydrocephalus can be brought to and have a shunt inserted. We have a survival rate that is not as good as I would like it to be, because there's always room for improvement, but the best that we can offer under the circumstances in Africa. And if Somaliland can do it, anybody can do it.
Thank you. That's a very, very powerful point. That will lead me then to asking to Natalia. You are working with the policymakers across Africa right now. So you guys have data around women. You just mentioned earlier that the environment the woman is growing up is also important for her build up. But we also know that we have issues, cultural issues, societal issues, precious issues. We have, here in the UK, we have girls looking at magazines, want to be somebody. And they can't, because they can't be that person, they don't eat food, or they don't have the right advice, for example. We spend so much money on girls, for example, in Africa, so many programs. So how can we change this environment and giving more confidence to girls, like you said, like Mama said earlier, give them more confidence, give them more education? How can we push the policymakers to help build a young girl to become a woman tomorrow?
Well, excellent. I think the policymakers have an important role, but as a community, we also have an equally important role. I think that maybe a place where the Western world has made more progress than Africa is that in Africa, as a girl, you go to school, but somehow there are cultural and social pressures that almost earmark a girl to marriage as a career, right? So I think there's a lot of public education that needs to happen. There's a lot of family education that needs to happen that tells a woman that actually you're worth more than a wife. Yes, you can be a wife, but you can be a lot of other things. The African Union right now and a number of agencies, DFID, UNFPA, have launched a brilliant campaign to end child marriage in Africa, because we know of the devastating physical and psychological effects of getting married at 12. But guess what? That initiative would not be enough if the policymakers are not putting the money aside for the sort of things that Mama is talking about in terms of building the range of skills. Because when young women believe that they can be great musicians, they can be great entrepreneurs, they can be doctors at a very young age, it changes the mindsets, and also the way they negotiate their way within the community, within school life, within different areas. So I think what's important for policymakers is that they need to be more deliberate in making investments to, one, identify and promote talent, in young women. They have to be more proactive in making sure that the education that African kids, and girls in particular, do get gives them leverage, because you cannot go to school and come out and be nothing to society. And so I believe that is really where things do matter. But then also, I just wanted to share my own personal story. My mother was an educator and she was a teacher. And one of the things that I benefited from her is that somehow, coincidentally, she was teaching one of my classes, I think in the 2nd grade. And because she is very open in terms of how she was teaching, I had maybe the privilege and the courage to say, when she writes something on the board and there's a spelling mistake, I'll say to her, Mom, no, that's not how you spell this. You've made a mistake, right? But then the fact that at a tender age of 7, I could say, no, Mom, that's wrong. And my colleagues in the classroom knew that it was okay actually to speak to authority and say, you can do it differently. That helped to mold me into the kind of woman that I am. What I'm trying to say is that let's also look at how the delivery of education changes so that what's in the child can also be tapped into as you build that child. And policymakers can play a very instrumental role in that process.
I think just on the point of policymakers as well, I mean, in Africa, I think that we need to check the way policymakers are behaving as well.
I was going to say some of them have child brides themselves.
If you have a senator with a 13-year-old wife,
absolutely.
or like a president with like 7 wives, no matter what policies they're putting out, their behavior is changing.
And that's what I said. It's a multiple interventions. There's policy level interventions, but there's mindsets. The value of a woman needs to be widened in terms of really what we can be.
You're right. I was going to ask the audience to ask some questions, but I'm just going to ask something to Nimco we just talked about earlier. The sugarcoating all these things we're doing in the UK. We're really sugarcoating stuff on the top. I mean, you are really kicking us and trying to educate people in certain subjects. Yeah. But we're spending so much money on the FGM programs, but so many women are suffering. So how can we, you said you just talked about breaking things down.
It's about deconstructing the African woman, and also this we keep saying education. Children in Africa are not being educated. No, our children here, they've been indoctrinated, and it's about that conversation about also the history of what an African woman is. And I think for me, I assumed that what I was learning. So at the age of 8, my teacher asked me to question everything, and I said why. And when I answered correctly, he gave me 1984 An Animal Farm, and George Orwell wrote about these things, about the indoctrination of people. And it's this whole thing. I grew up everybody talking about me as though I was some kind of victim. And I was just thinking, who's this poor African with flies all over their face you're talking about? That's not me. That's not the African that I know. And Comic Relief does that every single year where this thing we have, it's like you never see a positive. So recently I was working with
Comic Relief, please.
Recently I was working with the INGO. I was working with the INGO, and I said to them, and they were trying to raise money to end FGM. And I said, no, eradicate FGM as though it's some kind of virus. And I said, where's the positive message that as women in Africa, they're surviving and they are survivors, and that it's not you there to rescue, but there to empower. So it's about actually calling out. And if you feel uncomfortable with the Save the Children's pictures of dying African children, it's like, actually, that's not what Africa's about. It's about educating our own self. And for me, it was about educating myself about Africa. So I thought I was quite ingenious, thinking that I was going to bake cupcakes to talk about what vaginas look like, to get people to talk about genitals. But then I saw that I looked at in the late 70s and early 80s, a woman in Kenya in the Maasai community had carved a vagina out of Agnes. She's amazing, and she says everything very simply. She's like, I don't like that. It's disgusting. I'm like, great. But she carved a vagina out of wood, out of a tree, and went around and started showing people and saying, this is what they're taking away from me. There was women in Somalia that were actually singing to a female god because they thought the pain that was coming upon them was from a male god, because FGM, like forced marriage, like, being beaten and all these things. So African women have actually been leading the way. Africa has been leading the way, but we ultimately think that the Enlightenment era started in the 18th century when it didn't. So it's that whole kind of thing of actually, how do we educate children by taking them out of this indoctrination? And that's what I did for myself. And my grandmother and my mother in themselves were they were revolutionary. My grandmother never said that she was a feminist, because she'd be dead and I wouldn't be alive. But she ensured that every generation got a little bit better, to the point where we now have a 3-year-old that does those things, that she can correct me. I'm like, you better check yourself. but she can correct me, because she knows the fact that if I'm wrong, then why am that's something that she feels uncomfortable in. And for me, I thought to myself, I had the privilege to either, as Edna said, walk away and be empowered individually, or give back to the community and to the young girls that were not as lucky as I was. And for me, I think being silent about my own experience of FGM was very complicit to the misunderstanding of this poor African victim mentality. So yeah, that was just why I wanted to interject.
It was very important to put this panel together. How to build an African woman. Now I'm going to let each of the ladies to say 30 seconds, because we really need to go now. 30 seconds. How to build an African woman. We have heard about identity crisis. We have heard Ninko talking about really how we can kick ass and change the narratives around African women. We've also heard Natalia, something very powerful. You need to change your environment. We need to change the environment of the woman if you want to make a difference. We need to allow her to build herself. And we've heard also Mama Edmund giving us a big, big view of how to believe in yourself, how to be who you want to be. Now, Mama, I'm going to leave you to say something for 30 seconds, and then we'll close this panel now.
Well, I'm going to invest my 30 seconds in advocating that we train female school teachers. Because recently in my country there was a survey, and out of 1,300 school teachers, only 11 were women. You see why we're not doing as well? Train school teachers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Natalia, 30 seconds. Well, how can we build an African woman?
Well, we need to catch the African woman while young, and I think we need to recognize the special constraints that a young woman actually does first. We need to make sure that we provide and equip the young women with skills and with experiences and with opportunities that is going to build their leverage as they negotiate their way through their lives.
Superb. Excellent. Namko, 30 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to say to every single one of you that there's a revolution within inside all of you, and to take that forward and tell young women. And also, I'm working on a new global program to change the narrative of FGM in Africa. It is ending and it's being led by women. This global program is going to be launched on 10th of October on the International Day of the Girl. And how we will build an amazing Africa is to ensure that FGM ends.
One word. 30 seconds. You're just going to close session fast.
I think that we should concentrate on how we bring up our women and how we train our girls, because I think that that's the key to sort of changing the narrative around girls. If we can change the way that we bring them up and the ideas that we give them when they're growing up, then we can change the way that they go out into the world and the sort of impact that they have on the world. So that's my 30 seconds gone, I think.
We have gone well over our time. But one thing, take with you, please, believe in yourself. That's how I built myself. Thank you so much. Thank you.